I've got just a couple of process questions, and I'd like to start with Tom. As the picture editor, how, can you talk a little bit about your approach with Damien, because you've worked with Damien before. What's your approach to sound design and music? At what point do you start to draw the rest of the team into the conversations, and how are you using those elements while you're putting your cut together?
When I'm working with Damien, I worked with him on La La Land, I worked with him on Whiplash. We tend to draw on those resources immediately. So, and I know Justin can speak to this too, but when I started picture editing, which was exactly the same time they started shooting, I already had some animatics that were created for the big action scenes, and the animatics had Justin's music there already. Justin had been working on the music with Damien well before pre-production. So a lot of the cues were already there, and I implemented them immediately. And there was also some rough sound, not from Ai-Ling or Millie, but there was some rough sound that Damien had kind of cobbled together, things that he liked, that I tried to implement and work in. So I had those things to start with, but also, Ai-Ling had kind of scoured the script, and I had already a lot of recording of effects were done during dailies, and some of these things were recorded. I think Frankie went out and recorded a ton of stuff, and Ai-Ling recorded a ton of stuff as well, and everything would kind of filter through Ai-Ling, and then she would pass them to me. So I kind of had, these guys built a library for me of sounds, and a lot of those things were Foley type things like suits, air going through the helmets. I mean, everything kind of imaginable. More stuff than I even knew what to do with. But it also included, like a SpaceX launch and actual Apollo launches and different things that had to do with the spacecraft. And so when I started picture cutting, I had all of this stuff to begin with, and I tried to put a lot of that stuff into my first cuts. And even while they were shooting and while I was first putting stuff together, there were a couple things I remember sending to Ai-Ling. One thing in particular was a scene that we called the multi-axis trainer, where Ryan Gosling is strapped into this weird gyroscopic-looking contraption. And I think that was the first scene that we passed off. It was just an early cut to Ai-Ling, and she did a pass on that, and that's something that we put back into, I cut on Avid, and we put that back into the Avid, and I immediately started working with it. And once shooting wrapped and Damien joined, that process continued and kind of amped up. So as soon as Damien and I would get a picture cut done, or close, we'd send it to Ai-Ling, and she would do a sound pass on it. And then that started to extend to Millie, where we would have dialogue-related stuff that we would send to Millie. And I think an early thing we sent to Millie was a scene that was recorded in the rain, with some practical rain, which was very challenging and problematic. And so we would send things like that over to Millie, and she would, work on it, clean it up, and give it back to us. So very early on, I was working with elements from these guys, but then also we were just having kind of a back and forth, like a turnover, and we would just cycle through back and forth a lot, constantly. And this just continued all the way to the end.
So one of the things that we were talking about before we started, Frank and Tom, Jon, you guys didn't actually there were no temp mixes on this film. So usually that's a time to kind of experiment and rehearse some ideas and sort of get a feel for what the director wants to do, but you didn't have the benefit of any of that. So can you talk a little bit about, like, how did you, and this was your first time working with Damien, so how did you kind of approach that, just jumping in and mixing the film?
It is difficult not having temp dubs, but at the same time, it kind of lets you expand as you go. What we did do was went to one of the early previews, so we can let it sort of sink in. And, for the next couple months, you get to think about it. It's like, okay, what's going to change? First of all, music, knowing that the music is temp, but knowing that the final music is probably going to be very close to that. But then it changes, you know, as it did on this one, where it just kind of changes and gets better and bigger and, you know, all of those things. But it gives you a chance to think in your own mind, okay, how can we make this better and carry it forward? In this case, it was like it should sort of be documentary. That was the main word that we talked about. Luckily, we had the chance of Tom and Damien. Their cutting room was right next to the Hitchcock. So for lunch, pretty much every day for months, we got to see him. So once we thought of something, we could ask questions, you know, and sort of elaborate on things that we were thinking. And they would go, yeah, that's cool, go for it. Oh, yeah, it's great, cool. Always very supportive, or like, nah, maybe not on this one, next one, and something like that. So in a way, we got to really have time to think about it way before we got to the stage, before I started dialogue pre-dubs. Way before. So we had a lot of the answers, a lot of the directions sort of hammered out. So then it was pretty much the normal getting on stage and, you know, having new elements, tons of new elements. You know, the new music, of course, that's the first time anybody's really hearing the fresh score and the differences in the nuances. You know, is the harp you know, what kind of pluck is it? You know, I mean, just little tiny things that we would spend time on to make sure we got it exactly fit in. So it was, I would say it was. I dug it. I totally dug it. I mean, the no temp thing was new for us, but I totally dug it. It's a lot of fun.
So, question for you, Justin. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously you've known and worked with Damien Chazelle, the director, for a very long time. We were just talking, you guys went to college together. You worked on sort of his first kind of project, which you guys started together in college, and then obviously through Whiplash, and then, you know, La La Land, and now First Man. So what's your process for working with Damien? And so apparently you did some pre-score sketches for the initial animatics?
Yeah, so I started working with Damien when he started prepping the movie, so that was March of 17, and he started shooting it in October of that year. So he was, like any director, working several months with the whole team, the costume, production designer, cinematography, and Linus, the cinematographer. And so during that time, I was just doing my work of figuring out the themes, composing at the piano, figuring out, after we sort of locked down some melodies, then figuring out the sounds of the score, and then actually, once that was figured out, actually building mock-ups to scenes. Like Tom had mentioned, there were some big scenes of the movie that Damien really wanted scored before he shot it. Obviously that score changed once you get to post, and I'm seeing how they're cutting it, and I'm having to adjust a lot, but I think it's a little bit because of the background we had in making musicals. For something like any musical, really, you have to have a lot of music actually recorded before you shoot it. And for something like La La Land, there are big sequences like the waltz in the planetarium or the epilogue sequence where you have to have big pieces of music made so you can actually shoot to it and choreograph to it. And obviously this wasn't a musical, so that didn't have to be done the same way. But I think Damien he still liked approaching it, some of the scenes, in the same way, where he would go in knowing what the music was. He could storyboard to the music, as he did with musicals. He could have it on set. He could play it for the actors at times. He could, and then Tom and Damien could use it as the basis for their first cuts, and could. So there were certain sequences like the landing sequence where there was a mock-up that was all in. It was made, and I adjusted it later, but they started with that. Couple of other big sequences in the movie like that, where I had really a full orchestral mock-up. And then there was also just, because I had done so many demos and so many just experimentations with themes and sounds and arrangement, instrumentation ideas, we just had like a big folder of material that they used as temp to draw from. So I didn't even know how it was going to be used. There were just a lot of different harp and theremin, harp and ambience, some affected strings, just lots of different ideas, implementations of the melodies that we had decided on, that they just had a big folder, and they used that in those first cuts, or really for a long time as they were cutting the movie. And so I would get stuff from them. They would cut a scene. They would drop in a demo that they thought felt, you know, like temp music, but it just happened to be our temp music. They would drop it in, and then I would get it, and I would see, oh, I see what you're going for there. Let me respot it a little. Let me, you know, I think maybe the chords can fall a little differently against the picture, but if it would give me an idea of what they wanted, it was temp music. So I'd say, oh, you want a harp thing there, you want a violins thing there. So it was really helpful.
Cool. So we've got a couple of clips, and I'm going to presume because the movie just opened yesterday that most people haven't had the benefit of seeing it yet. But before we roll into this first clip, Ai-Ling and Mildred, I wanted to ask you, so the documentary is a term that I'm hearing a lot with you guys talking about the film, and it seems like that was sort of a very important design approach to the film. So before we watch this first clip, can you talk a little bit about what that meant for you on the sound effects and the dialogue side, and how that influenced your approach?
Well, for the sound effects side, the documentary feel for me is to have this grounded, gritty feel to it, that it shouldn't be too polished sounding. And so a lot of the Earth scenes, you know, they are more of the intimate, personal moments between Neil, the astronauts, and his family. So for the the backgrounds and the Foley and the effects that we did, basically we tried to attempt to give it a more of a grounded, gritty feel, and so also in the mix, we have a narrower mix field, and also, we have
I want to follow up on what you just said. What do you mean a narrower mix field?
It's basically, in the mix when we do it, the panning, it's just the image is just narrower, because later on, in a few of the set pieces, we needed to open it up and surround the audience.
So you wanted contrast? Yeah,
we wanted the contrast, and so with that, and then so. Ironically, we needed to contrast that in some of these cockpit scenes so that it's more immersive and visceral, to give you a feel of danger when they are going up to space, from Neil's perspective. For us, that's that.
Yes, and for me, I had to, my approach on this film, because we wanted to have this documentary feel, the dialogue, the production sound had to sound the way the film looked. So in the film, it's shot in Super 16, so there's a lot of grain, and you kind of wanted that same feeling to the production sound. So I normally, on a lot of films, I will spend a lot of time really cleaning it up, using lav mics instead of the mixed channel, just to get a more stronger signal, things like that. And but this approach, we wanted it to sound more like it was in a real world environment. So for example, some scenes Tom would cut with the mixed channel, like for example, Mission Control. Everybody was mic'd. It was a huge scene with, I don't know how many channels, like 20.
It was like 24, I had 24 tracks of audio, because I think they mic'd every man in the Mission Control.
Every single person had their own mic, and then when, so normally when you would cut a scene like that, you would just use all those ISO mics, but we ended up presenting that, and then it got kicked back, and then because it wasn't documentary enough.
Because it was too clean?
Too clean, yes. So then I worked with Susan Dawes, a really great dialogue editor, and so it was like picking and choosing, okay, well, we'll leave the mixed channel here, but then these specific lines will go in for the ISO mic. So it was a different approach. It wasn't your typical Hollywood soundtrack, but we obviously wanted people to understand what they were saying, but feel more Damien kept saying we want to hear and see and feel life. So life being like paper rustling or the sound of the reflection in the room, things like that.
Sorry, just add one more thing. So the other thing about this is also because it has this documentary feel to it, we want it to be as authentic as we can, so we try to add as many original and authentic sound recordings that we can, and also meanwhile, sometimes in some of the moments during those set pieces, we wanted to go into the emotional feeling of being in it, of feeling inside Neil's head space. So so sometimes we may have to embellish it with something not so authentic or not so usual. But so sometimes what I do in processing some of the sounds is to introduce some like distortion or over-modulation to the sounds. So it has this just this gritty feel that it just sticks to what you see on screen.
Tom, one of the things that I noticed watching the movie, and then it just struck me again in that sequence, you play a lot of this movie in close-ups. It's claustrophobic. It's really tight, and I think it's a very different approach than maybe what we're used to seeing. Sort of like wide shots, establishing scale. It has a very emotional, feeling, and I think you end up leaning on sound in order to build out the rest of the world that's outside the frame. But can you talk about that approach and why you guys made the film in this particular way visually?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Damien, I think was very aware of a lot of space movies and science fiction movies that had come before, and he's fans of a lot of those. And I mean, I think when you think of the quintessential kind of sci-fi space movie, you think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is so futuristic and so space age. And something that Damien really loved about the subject matter of First Man was digging into the archival NASA footage, which was often shot by astronauts in 16mm, and he just loved the gritty feel of that, and felt like we could tell our story this way, and felt like that might help make our story more intimate and more personal. And that was a big goal because a lot of people are familiar with iconography. A lot of people are familiar with Neil Armstrong as an icon, and so he figured the only point in making the movie would be as if we could tell a very personal, intimate story. So he was inspired by this NASA archival footage and thought, wow, wouldn't this be great if we could tell a story where it would feel like we took a 16mm documentary cameraman and put them into a space capsule and then shot them off into space. So, in
Dolby Atmos.
In Dolby Atmos, exactly. So, his big directive for us was to make these, be a fly on the wall with the family, like a cinema verite documentary, but also not only be a fly on the wall in the space capsule, but have the space capsule scenes somehow be immersive and have it almost be like a VR experience. He really wanted to put the audience in the capsule and show them how these capsules were more like submarines or tanks. They were more machine age than space age, and in that way, the hope was that the audience would really feel how dangerous and how risky these missions were. So it was really important to Damien to lean into the subjective. And so from the picture side, he shot a lot of point of view shots, a plethora of point of view shots, and a lot of shots of our actors and their eyes looking at things and experiencing the world. And on this film, Damien really wanted to do something we hadn't really done in the same way for La La Land and Whiplash, and that was he wanted my picture editing to kind of make room for sounds and stuff like that. So that's something new that we did on this film that was different from what we had done before. So that meant that, I would set up a pictorial edit where, we would see the rivets in the ships. I would have cutaways of gauges and rivets in the walls of these tiny capsules, and that would be the place where we'd say, okay, this is where we're going to have Ai-Ling's amazing sound of the creaks and the groans of the ship, and then we're going to answer that with, with the looks on the faces of the astronauts, feeling the anticipation or feeling a sense of dread in some cases that they're about to be launched. But it was something where Damien really wanted to play around with the sound and play around with contrasts, and so it was all about building up the sound and getting the audience used to tiny minutia, like little creaks in the craft when they're getting buckled into the craft. And then in one moment, hearing the sound of a housefly that somehow gets into the capsule, and you really focus on that. and then moments later we have a countdown, and then the sound gets completely insane because we go into a launch where it's completely dependent on what sound is doing. And pictorially it goes into abstraction, but it's the sound that really tells the story. And so Damien really wanted to lean into that.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because you know, I think one of the things that I've learned in this business is that great sound design moments don't really happen by accident in post-production. They're thought about that way at the script stage. They're shot that way. They're edited that way because, as you say, you have to give room for those moments to happen. So, Ai-Ling, can you talk a little bit about the sound design in this particular sequence? Because I'm hearing a lot of really cool abstract stuff happening, especially with the sounds of the ship. So, not to give away any of the secret sauce, but like what? How did you make this X-15 experience? Because obviously most of us have never been in an X-15 at 175,000 feet, right?
Me neither. But thanks. That's a good question. So, you know, the X-15 is like the first opening sequence in the movie, just throws it right in it. And a lot of it is, you know, early on in the early conversations with Damien, you know, one of the film references he told me to watch was Das Boot for the space travel. And so, you know, they are basically, you know, shooting up into the sky, you know, in this like fragile spacecraft that like it's dangerous and hostile environment. And so for the X-15, we wanted to be as authentic as we could. But sometimes we need to go into something more emotional to give you that sense of unease and surprise. And so, you know, early on the ascent, the X-15 is basically like a rocket, but looks like an aircraft. So during the ascent, we have like rockets sound and, you know, some engine sounds that ascend up. And when it breaks through the atmosphere, you know, we try to introduce some of the recordings that we made, that we recorded from SpaceX, the Falcon Heavy launch, with the actual sonic booms. And by the time he gets through the atmosphere, because we wanted to create this sense of unease and surprise, we just like built the sound up to play with dynamics, and so we just build it up into like extremely loud moment and just immediately drop it into like a quiet moment. And that's when, you know, you see the Earth's horizon and then Justin's music comes in. But, you know, in order to build it up, because Damien wants it to be really intense and surprising and like really like visceral, and so he would say things like, you know, try and surprise me. And so one of the things that, you know, they tried also in the picture added is the introduction of like animal sounds. So we just took that idea and, you know, used sounds of like elephant roars, lion growls, even like animal stampede that builds up to the moment when he turns off the X-15. The other thing is, because they are in these tight enclosures, we wanted to give it this tight, closed space, turbulence, sense of turbulence, shakes and rattles. So one of the things that we did, you know, we tried to record a bunch of other things, but I was trying to, one of the things I recorded were some motion simulator rides when the machine, when it injects low frequencies to like heavily shake the entire vehicle or vibrate the entire vehicle. And also a lot of the metal creaks and groans were made by our Foley walkers, Dan O'Connor and John Cucci. And, but basically, you know, the sequence that you just saw, when he activated the thrusters and all that, you know, they were some of the thrusters that like we went out to record at a small rocket company in Mojave Desert. They were developing like lunar landers. So we recorded some of the trusses there, so we were able to use it here. And so as he's like trying to fight and cut through the Earth's atmosphere, Damien was like, I want it to be like really mean and angry. And so, yeah, so I happened to find this like set of recordings from this one guy. It was like a crowdfunded like sound library of like elephant recordings out in Thailand. So, so I just like took those elephant growls.
Angry elephant became angry X15.
Yes, and put them through like some decapitator, the sound toys plugin, just and some of the explosions, just to give it like this really overmodulated, angry vibe to it.
Amazing. Justin, can you talk a little bit about, so this documentary approach and the visually, the aesthetics of this claustrophobia and a lot of the things being shot in close-up. So that emphasis on reality, how did that affect the music? And what is it, you know, it's an interesting music for a documentary approach. How did you handle that?
Yeah, that took the most trial and error, figuring out how to incorporate music, but have it be a really, really light touch, not get in the way. It's funny because the movie kind of has two facets to it. It has that really grounded documentary style, and then it has a lot of scenes, mostly in space, where it's grand and it's supposed to be kind of a spectacle. So the music had to do kind of both things, and it had to be on both sides of that. Sometimes the music is sweeping and very much out front, and then other times, mostly in the domestic scenes, it had to be very quiet and intimate. But we wanted it to all feel of a piece, like it was the same score. So we kind of knew how to score the big scenes. It was the little scenes that you're talking about, which were the really hard ones. So we tried to settle on. We had them themes done, you know, early on. We knew what those were, but then it was mostly an issue of instrumentation and just figuring out ways to orchestrate it so that it could be very, very light. And we found that harp was really a key to a lot of it, because a harp, it decays really quickly. It's gentle. Whereas in space, it was a lot of full orchestration, strings and brass and theremin and things that really sustain. On Earth, we wanted it to decay really quickly. So it basically left us with, what are those options? It's piano, guitar, harp. You know, those are the instruments that have really light touches. And we had sort of thrown out piano as an option. We didn't want a piano score, and guitar didn't really make sense. So we settled on the harp. The harp has a lot of fragility, a lot of vulnerability that really seemed to fit the style of the camera style, the really sort of unsteady, fragile sort of frames, and as well as Neil's character, and then found other ways to sort of, when there were other orchestral elements like strings, to filter them through. We put them through a rotor cabinet to, again, thin them out and give them a little bit of grit that felt like it matched the 16 millimeter or like the film stock, putting it through some analog gear, the rotor cabinet, to give it this sort of shaky, gritty feel. And then a lot of it really is the mix, and it was what Jon and these guys did at the end, finding the place it sits. And it was really all those friends and family screenings and preview screenings that we did just with the Avid. It was one of the biggest challenges, was just figuring out where the music could sit in those domestic scenes in a way that it wouldn't stand out. And I struggled with it. Tom struggled with it. It was really a challenge. And then, you know, Jon did his work and had it sit, and it really, really transformed the score and the whole reaction to the score and the whole reaction to how the music was playing in the movie through all those intimate scenes, because it was such a delicate balance, and it really took such a fine touch, and also not just where it sits as an overall level, but where it peaks out. I mean, there's this one, it's the last scene of the movie, and I won't give away too much about it, but it's this very intimate scene between Neil and Janet, and the music had to, it had to enter almost invisibly, and then Jon brought it up at this moment, and right at that moment, it just highlights the emotion of the scene, and it doesn't get in the way. It's still such a verite. It's shot, and it feels so documentary, but this one little move in the music, it it made the emotion tenfold. And that's not a move we had. That was something that they found, you know, in the final mix of that scene. So.
One of the things that I think you guys, as a team, did so well is use contrast in the film, and obviously there are these big, huge moments, and then suddenly things just really die away, and you can just hear some breath, and it's that modulation really engages the ear and keeps it really, really interesting. So I thought that was just fantastic. Frank and Jon, can you talk a little bit about how you used Atmos in the mix? This was a native Atmos mix from the beginning?
Yeah, we mixed it in Hitchcock Theater. When Ai-Ling and I were going through premixes, we never, kind of the gauges never crossed the gimmick line for the sake of Atmos. We benefit from bass extension into the surrounds. So we really kind of just kept it to key moments when it meant something or you can actually hear it. I think the first time we really kind of extended out was in the multi-access trainer. That stuff kind of moved through the array really well. So it lent itself, that particular scene lent itself to filling the overheads to showcase at that moment. Throughout the piece, I think it was really just far and few between. Man, that sounds like sounds like one of the ships coming apart. So virtual reality at its finest, monaural. So we really kind of just picked and chose what would go into the array in Atmos, the overheads, and how those and how it affected the film and the tone and the emotion. If it was that particular sequence was very scary, I don't want to give anything away. It was pretty scary what they had to go through in training, and then we did some stuff early on with the X-15 and some of the movement, exterior movement that was kind of fun, just some of the airs and whatnot. But it was really just kind of really precise and exact and never made you go away from the storyline or the screen. So that's how we handled that.
One of the Atmos qualities I really like is the full range surrounds, and it works so well for this film because of all the during some of these cockpit rocket scenes, it needs that size and to immerse the audience in it. And so I think we made use of a lot of that during, say, like even the Apollo launch or the Gemini launch sequences to kind of put, to kind of pan some of the rocket roars recordings and some of the JPL acoustic chamber recordings that we did, just surround the whole audience with it, and so that would mean, even like during the Gemini 8 mishap section, you have all the spinning sounds that to help sell to the audience that they are like spinning at like so many revolutions per second or per minute. We had a lot of fun, playing around with picking
Flying
up
that stuff around the room.
elements. Yeah, like panning it, either sideways along the walls, across the ceiling, or front and back.
Right,
So.
but also importantly, to your point, it's backed up by the visuals and it's dictated by the story. It's not just kind of having fun for fun's sake.
No. Yeah.
I do want to go. I want to go to audience for questions, but before we do that, just really quick, because it's so rare to have a picture editor come to participate in these kind of conversations. I wanted to ask Tom. You've got two very powerful tools at your disposal from a sound perspective. You've got music and you've got sound design. So how do you, from your perspective in working with Damien, how do you pick and choose what's going to step forward in a particular moment?
That's a good question. I think that, it's funny, music is, Justin's score is, his scores are always so filled with emotion. And I love the way Jon put it in terms of even the biggest cues were so very delicate. There's so much nuance in these cues, and it doesn't take much to really feel them in a way, And so I think Damien is a musician too. He's a musical background. I don't. I know nothing. But I feel like it doesn't take much to really start to feel, the emotion from these cues. And so I think we really approach them as elements that we really should be very careful about overusing. And I know, and I think Justin felt the same way. Like there were times during our rough cut process where maybe I think Justin would even chime in. I think we're using too much. We're leaning too much on this, or there's I think it's we're too wall to wall here or something. So it's something that I think automatically, because we know how powerful it potentially is, that we really try to hold back in some ways with it. And a lot of the set piece scenes, such as the Gemini 8 launch, we knew from the beginning were going to be very sound design heavy. There were some hard decisions that Damien made early on, where he wanted the sequence to take place. I don't think I'm spoiling too much if you haven't seen it, but he wanted the Gemini 8 launch to take place entirely inside that space capsule, and he wanted it to be backed up by sound design, and there would not really be any score there. It would just be sound design, and that's the way we tempt it. And so I mocked it up with sound effects in my LCR Avid environment, and it was kind of a sketch, and that I think helped inform Ai-Ling, where we wanted certain peaks and valleys and things like that. But then, Ai-Ling and Frankie and Johnny took it to this whole other level where they could actually start making it a real environment. The creaks and the groans that I had just placed in there in mono, coming through, like a center channel, could all of a sudden be placed at different parts of the room, and they would come to life in ways that I just couldn't do, and it was hard for me to even imagine. But I think also, because Damien is again really great with establishing contrast. He feels like that accentuates things on either side. If he made a decision to say the Gemini 8 is going to be very reliant on sound design, the Apollo 11 launch has to be completely different. It's going to be different pictorially. It's going to be on the outside of the craft mainly. It's going to be larger, epic. You'll have tons of wide shots. It's going to be monumental, and that's where Justin's score comes in, where it is backed up by amazing sound design, but because I know that Apollo 11 was a very important launch for Damien. I think, as he always puts it, the Saturn V rocket was you can clarify, made the largest man-made sound next to an atomic bomb or something like that. And Damien kept hammering Ai-Ling about that, saying, but it's like an atomic bomb, so you have to do something.
Be big, right? Yeah.
Even during pre-production, he mentioned it.
Yeah, I think he mentioned it more than once. But anyways, we knew that besides that, it would really be heavily reliant on Justin's score, and that launch in particular we knew would be something where we could ride on his score. And then there were other scenes like the Gemini 8 docking sequence where there's a waltz, a beautiful piece that Justin made. We knew that would be extremely reliant. It would just float on his cue.
It almost felt like a nice little homage to 2001.
Absolutely.
With a little bit of Tales of Hoffman maybe thrown in there.
It's our melody, but then we orchestrated exactly like the class. That's all the classical music that inspired 2001 and other things.
It's fantastic. Let's go to. There's a hand. We'll start with some questions from the audience.
Hello, how's it going? I got to see the movie earlier this week. It was fantastic. It was insane. But two things that really stood out to me was the metal creaking, like the dangers of the ship. You really felt like one of those screws was going to pop out. And then the busyness of the different rooms, like Mission Control and like the White House and the funerals. So how much of that was originally recorded, or how much time did you get to record, like for the metal? And then it's so hard to find good walla, so was that all originally recorded as well?
Yeah, a lot of the wallas that you hear in those scenes were recorded on set. So Mission Control, it's almost all we supplemented it a tiny bit. In fact, that was one of those areas where I added some group, and Damien's like, get rid of it, because he really wanted, and there was plenty there, and he didn't want to overdo it. He didn't want to make it too dramatic. He wanted it to be very, very natural. So yeah, so all those guys were mic'd, so we were able to use those wallas. And at the funerals, supplemented them a little bit with some group wallas in the funerals. And what was the other one that you mentioned?
The White House was like
the White
really
House.
busy.
That was all production walla. It was amazing, and we actually then even added more of it that was originally there. That stuff was great. So.
And then for the metal, did you do a bunch of original recordings, and how much time do you have to record, like before you start editing?
So specifically for the metal, a lot of it for the creaks and groans and were made by Dan O'Connell and John Cucci, our Foley walkers, but. A lot of it is also some of the intense shakes and stuff. We kind of, like I said earlier, we did some recordings earlier. So besides some of the motion simulator shakes and stuff, most of it, we didn't really record as much on the shakes and on the metal creaks and groans. They were like mostly from some of the sound libraries. But sometimes we did try to also use sounds that's like not really like a handshaked kind of shakes, because then sometimes it can sound kind of artificial and not natural. So we had some recordings of different metal where when you attach some kind of like bass vibration things that you get maybe in the car's boombox, and when you attach them, and so we have that natural shake. But most of them, we are just trying to accentuate the sharpness that if something should break, that piercing, sharp shakes could kind of kill you.
You definitely got a sense that these things could come apart at any second. You communicated very well that this was a very dangerous endeavor to be flying these aircraft. Right over here.
So I haven't seen the film yet, but from these examples and from what you guys were talking about before, my question is more for Justin and Tom and your collaboration, and how it seems like it's more of an example. This movie is an example of music done right, where it starts early in the process, as opposed to the more traditional way of composing to the picture lock, perhaps. So it seems like that's more and more the trend. Like for example, Ludwig was speaking about something similar before. So my question to you guys is, what are the benefits of that, apart from the obvious ones of directors perhaps falling in love with temp music, but other benefits that you see in that process, and if you see perhaps this going more, the process of composing music for film as kind of like building a temporary perhaps library of music beforehand, of thematic material and perhaps sonic material, and then sort of finessing that after the picture is locked. Is that the process that it seems to be happening?
I mean, me, Damien, and Justin kind of continued a workflow that we had started on La La Land out of necessity, because La La Land was a musical. We really had to. We're very reliant on Justin creating cues early on, and then we ended up using them. But we did a thing where, Justin set up a room adjoining my room, and we shared a door. So we were really, we worked very, very closely together. And it was kind of like I'd say it was always like a TV sitcom where we would some character would just like waltz in without, unannounced.
Which one of you was Kramer?
And it was usually Justin. And but it's very different from other projects I've worked on where where the music kind of follows or chases the picture. Damien's a musician, and so he has a very specific point of view on how he wants to do things, and he has very specific musical tastes. And when we're working together, he'll often know a music edit that he thinks will work or won't work. And so we're a couple steps ahead with him in a way, and I think it's very director reliant. So it's really what works for that particular director. But for Damien, a lot of what Justin would do would really inform the picture cutting, and not the other way around. I mean, we would certainly pass picture to Justin, and then he would have to kind of rework what he had done. But often. He would do things musically that he felt were best for the music emotionally, and that would require some picture changes. And that, almost always was received well by Damien and by me, and we would make some adjustments. If we really didn't feel like we could make the adjustment, then we would say we can't do it. But most of the time, we would really be very open about adjusting, and that's not always the case when I've worked on other projects where, I think the directive from the filmmaker is to the music is just to the music editor, just make it work. I don't care. It doesn't. I can't tell, so it doesn't matter. But Damien and Justin have very sensitive ears, and so it was something where we would do this cycle back and forth to make sure that musically and emotionally it was working, and often that meant the picture kind of followed. And in order to do that, we felt it necessary to work very closely together. Yeah,
and before we even get to the editorial process, I need time to figure out a lot of stuff. Like Damien and I really love melodic scores and thematic scores, and just finding a melody can take a really long time, and we don't want to be caught in post-production with a certain number of weeks left, and still, at that point you just need to score the picture, and so we need to know what those melodies are before and what the sounds are, what the instrumentations are before. So that's why we start as soon as pre-production starts. It took about 2 months of me just working at the piano, just sending piano demos to Damien, and that's been our process since the first movie we did, just emailing MP3s all day long, and I email one off and he says, no, I hate it. And then an hour later I have another idea and I email it, no, don't like it. And so we just keep going through, and then maybe there's, oh, that one's interesting, let's explore that. Where could that go? What could a B section of it be? How could it unfold? Experiment, go down that road, and then usually throw it out and keep going until we have a main theme, and in the case of most movies, this movie, a couple of subordinate themes that we're just like really confident in, and we feel like really serve the story. So that takes a long time, and it took a couple months at the piano before we even got to instrumentation ideas, sonic ideas. So I need that time. Maybe I'm slower than most. Maybe we're just more. We just take our time with that, and then after that, this movie was different in the sense that we had to find. We knew there had to be a sonic element as well, because it couldn't just be an orchestra in a room like La La Land. It couldn't be a big band like Whiplash. We had to figure out a sound for it. So there were a few months of getting some. Like learning how to use some production stuff I hadn't used before, getting some modular synths, learning how those work, getting a theremin, learning how to play around with that. So we just wanted to make sure that we were as prepared as possible, so that when we got to post, we could just score the scenes and we weren't figuring out the big building blocks of it.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. We have to wrap this up, but I really want to thank Ai-Ling and Mildred and Tom, Justin, Frank, and Jon for coming out to talk with us today about First Man.